interstitial cells in the male, those cells that are in between the seminiferous tubules and associated with the blood vessels, are going to bind what hormone?
LSH, 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 FSH, LH.
ABC.
A through Z.
Leydig,
So,
LH.
from the anterior pituitary, in response to pulses of DNRH from the hypothalamus, we have LH binding to the interstitial cells, and they then secrete testosterone, all right? And the chemical pathway in which they do so was they take cholesterol and convert it to testosterone, but first of all, they convert it to androstenedione. And then convert that to testosterone, all right? The testosterone goes to the Sertoli cells and binds to the androgen binding protein. And it also binds to other cells, but within the Sertoli cells, it can be converted to small amounts of estrogen in the presence of 5-alpha reductase. And that produces the dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. Everybody remember what this does? It also happens in the other parts of the body. It's the secondary sexual characteristics that DHT contributes to. And that Caribbean island, that's what they didn't have enough of, was that 5-alpha reductase until puberty. Okay. So, now in the female,
Sorry, what did you say first?
it converts testosterone to dihydrotestosterone instead of DHT. That's what causes the phenotype of the male. And then at puberty, the denser bone and muscle tissue. But in the fetus, it's the development of the glans penis instead of glans clitoris, and the scrotum instead of the labia minora or majora that we have. So in the female, what is our homologous structure to the interstitial cells? Thica interna cells, exactly correct. So in the female, we have the theca interna cells.
Oh, duh, we just learned that today.
Those are the ones that were formed outside of our follicles. They are also going to bind LH. Remember the equivalent to homologous pattern? So when I was, up until about 10 years ago, this always bothered me in the back of my brain, or the forefront of my thinking. Anyway, it's just kind of there. If this is truly equivalent, the same cells that make the male hormone testosterone and the female should be making, the same one should be making estrogen. And it just didn't make sense. So I will show you now why it works, okay? One of those aha moments when I was going through and making different slides and getting ready for class. So the equivalent cell to the interstitial cells in the female are the theca interna cells. They bind to LH And they will do this same pathway. They are going to take cholesterol, and they are going to convert cholesterol to androstenedione. A little bit of it will be made into testosterone. So women do make testosterone.
Oh.
All right? When a woman enters menopause or is in menopause or has her ovaries removed as a part of a radical hysterectomy, she has a decreased sex drive or libido, which is severe, may be treated with additional testosterone. It has to be added with balanced estrogen and progesterone, so it depends on whether she wants to go through that whole process of figuring out what those levels are. But this same chemical sequence occurs in the theca interna cells. But the female hormone is not testosterone, it is
Estrogen.
It
Or
is
progesterone.
estrogen, for the typical one. And so what happens is the androstenedione crosses the basement membrane so out here, these are theca, this is happening in the theca interna, right? So it crosses the basement membrane. And in the equivalent cells of the female to the male, the follicular cells, those are equivalent to the Sertoli cells. What hormone do they bind? FSH. So under influence of SSH, a little bit of testosterone in the Sertoli cells are converted to estrogen. A lot of testosterone in the follicular cells is converted to estrogen. So the androstenedione, not the testosterone, the androstenedione is going to be converted to estrogen. Estradiol is the most common form of those estrogens. On the top of page 114, it's a small view of this slide. I showed the same one for for male, but it was reversed. We ended up with testosterone instead of estrogen. All right, so here in the theca interna cells, cholesterol is converted to androstenedione. All right, most of it is sent to the follicular cells and further converted to estradiol. After ovulation, remember I said the theca interna cells change and we see the corpus luteum as a combination of both the theca interna cells and the corpus luteum. Now the theca interna cells take that cholesterol and convert it to progesterone. Again, LH. So the theca interna cells are going to produce cholesterol, androstenedione, and the androstenedione is formed primarily to estrogen by the follicular cells. But after ovulation, the theca interna cells will take the cholesterol and convert it into progesterone. So again, enforcing that equivalency, I found this diagram. Seminiferous tubules formed by the Sertoli cells. Outside the Sertoli cells, we have the interstitial cells or Leydig cells. In the female, we don't truly have a seminiferous tubule, but we have our oocyte here, and around that, follicular cells or granulosa cells. Outside of that, theca interna cells. Okay? So that equivalency anatomically or histology, the interstitial cells are equivalent to the theca interna cells. The Sertoli cells are equivalent, homologous to the follicular cells. And then I wrote out this pathway. All right, so in the male and in the female both, LH stimulates testosterone production. In the male, that's occurring in the Leydig cells. In the female, that's occurring in the theca interna cells. Testosterone crosses the basement membrane and is converted to estradiol in the male in the Sertoli cells, in the female in the follicular cells. So that homology, that equivalency still exists. Right? Proportion-wise, more estrogen in the female, more testosterone in the male. But the equivalency is still there. This is a little bit clearer than what I wrote on the board, but same thing.
I found that somewhere on one of your slides, but I don't know.
Should be in the lecture notes slides on the under reproductive physiology.
That's why I'm in the wrong one.
Okay, any questions on that one? So this is the origin of those hormones. All right, so now let's look at the cycling that occurs. It's more apparent in a female than is in the male. We saw these changes that we went through before break of the follicle. And now this kind of summarizes, we've got images of each of these separately, but this kind of summarizes it all together. And I don't think I have one where it's all on the same page. It's separate and it's in your PowerPoint slides all on the same page. So the ovarian cycle is the primary follicle to secondary follicle to antral follicle to mature antral follicle and ovulation. All right. The uterine cycle is what you see on the bottom of the screen. So this is the ovarian cycle here. All right. The uterine cycle is the stages of increasing thickness of the stratofunctionalis and loss as the menses. So that's the uterine cycle. And the hormones that we look at are FSH and LH and estrogen and progesterone. So in laying out all this is kind of tied in together as the menstrual cycle, which is really referring to the uterine cycle. We have an approximate 28 days if a woman's cycle is regular. Okay. Once menses starts, so that would be the first day of the period, all right? Once menses starts, so day 1 over here, you can count back and say that ovulation occurred at day 14. What you cannot do is on the first day of menses say that ovulation is going to occur in 14 days. It might be 17, it might be 3 months, it might be 5 weeks. This part here is variable. It may be very, very consistent for some women. All right. I had irregular cycles until I had my kids. So I started my period when I was in 8th grade all through high school. I might go an entire academic year and never have a period. Or I might have 2. Very hard to be prepared, whether or not to have a pad or a tampon or something available. I mean, it was fine. I didn't have cramps and it was fine not to think about it, but the first day I had it was kind of disconcerting. My sisters had pretty regular cycles. My older sister started college and didn't have a period for about 7 months. My mother, who is an OBGYN nurse, well, she's retired now, freaked. my sister home from Tennessee to Maryland and had her examined. And I think that was the most mentally upsetting thing that ever happened to my sister, was to have her parents, at least my mom, not believe her when she said that she wasn't pregnant. Like, Mom, I know how you get pregnant. I haven't had intercourse. But she had walked from the college to her biology teacher's house for her Friday night dinner, and my mother was imagining all sorts of things that had happened. It didn't help, by the way, that when she went to, and here's why my mother freaked out, and I can understand. When she thought, okay, well, this is kind of strange, I haven't had a period. She went to the college health center. They did a pregnancy test and told her it was positive. And she was like, well, I haven't had sex. I haven't fooled around. I haven't even kissed a guy. So there's no way that it can be positive. And the fact that my mother believed the test and not her, I mean, it's understandable, I suppose, being a mother now, but not for my sister at 17 to not be believed. But there are false positive and false negative tests that can occur, especially back in the mid-70s. This would have been 75, 76. So this whole thing can be due to diet, not eating enough fat in your diet, all right? Using up all that fat for energy. So many professional women athletes or college athletes are just a woman trying to lose weight, and kind of like I was out there, exercising 8 hours a day. You have no adipose fuel left to make steroid hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So again, this can be very variable. This is pretty set. So if a woman thinks she's pregnant, she goes in, they always say, what's your LMP, last menstrual period? And so they'll start, if you are pregnant, they'll start the timing from your last menstrual period, which, as we discussed earlier, is actually at least, maybe more, 2 weeks prior to ovulation and fertilization. Okay? We'll pick that up a little bit tomorrow because we're going to be talking about fertilization tomorrow. So, the cycling is started, kind of, really to me, a period is said to have started, and a cycle is said to have started the week that to me is really ending. It's easier to identify the first day of bleeding, right? And so when we look at the mid-Cs, that's the loss of that stratum functionalis. The primary oocytes in their primary follicles that are starting to develop here are not the ones that are released at the end of this month. I didn't realize that until I taught a reproductive physiology class at Sac State 2 or 3 years ago. And I had to do the research because all the textbooks were terrible. So I had to basically write my own material. But these follicles that are developing here are not going to be ovulated for another 12 or 13 months. But every month, a new batch, okay, 10, 12, 15 or so of them, will start to develop. We see this cycling of the hormones, this pulsatile that is still needed for the maturation of the other follicles. So as we see more follicles developing, each of them making estrogen, you can see why there is a rise in estrogen levels. Okay? So increased number of follicular or granulosal cells, increased number of estrogens. Hormonal cycle is explained in that aspect. With and after we lose our stratum functionalis, these higher amounts of estrogen reflect their function in the uterine lining as a thickening of the stratum functionalis. Estrogen is like a growth factor, right? It increases the mitosis of the epithelial cells forming the surface in the glandular epithelium. It increases the mitosis of the fibroblasts and the collagen fibers that they make, providing the connective tissue. So we have rising levels of estrogen. Rising levels of estrogen cause FSH levels to fall. There's a negative feedback effect, except at this point where we have a moderately high level of estrogen causes a surge of GnRH, resulting in a peak of LH and a smaller peak of FSH. That's a positive feedback. So here we're seeing negative feedback. Here we're seeing a positive feedback with that sharp increase of estrogen. Kind of flips and does the opposite thing. The spike in LH is what results in the rupture, increase increased fluid production in the antrum and the rupture of the follicle in ovulation. Okay.
So the LH is what causes ovulation.
Estrogen causes that, but that causes the
The
that.
direct-
Yes,
is-
the direct effect. Okay. Now, we continue, estrogen levels fall for a bit, but this is where the corpus luteum now is going to become active. And so estrogen levels will rise again, but the major hormone active after ovulation is progesterone. Prior, estrogen, as we see the thickening, after ovulation, progesterone. So estrogen continues to maintain a growth of the stratum functionalis, but it is progesterone that is providing the rapid growth of those spiral arteries we talked about on Tuesday, providing the nutrients to all of that tissue. Fertilization for the egg needs to occur within 24 hours. The egg is not, obviously, you can't fertilize it before it's ovulated. Beyond 24 hours, the fertilized egg is less viable. Okay, so you might push it to 30, 36, but it's 30, 24 is kind of the average of what is given. Anybody know for sperm? How long are sperm viable and can fertilize the egg?
12 hours.
No? About 72 hours. It might get pushed and you might see some places that say 90. But average is 72 hours, so 3 days. What you're thinking of maybe is if you add the 3 days to the front and the back, you have a week there of fertility. So in other words, if you have intercourse and the sperm enter the female reproductive tract 3 days before, the very end of that would be the end of the 72 hours. Or 3 days after, the ovary's not gonna, the egg is not gonna be viable for no more than a day. So sometimes the couples who are trying to use a rhythm method will say, okay, the sperm's only viable for 3 days, so if I don't have intercourse 4 days before and 4 days after, but you have to know that you've ovulated, all right? Then, and there's been stories where women have gotten pregnant by having intercourse when they were menstruating. It might have been spotty, but you don't have any ovulation at that point. Okay? Now, when my younger sister wanted to get pregnant, she did a lot of reading, and they wanted a boy as their first child. And so, on average, obviously, statistically, you have a 50-50% chance of producing a Y sperm versus an egg sperm. The egg is always X. So, 50-50% chance that the sperm fertilizing the egg is going to be Y, which would create a male fetus, versus X, which would create a female fetus. So, per chance. However, and I haven't read scientific studies, I've read tales, myths. It is true that about 50-50 children, babies that are born, are girls and boys, but boys more of them tend to die in the first few months after birth. However, in the creation, in the fertilization, for some reason, and I haven't seen publication of the race results, but for some reason, the sperm with the Y chromosomes appear to swim faster. The sperm with the X chromosomes are more viable in the female reproductive tract. So, if you wanted to have a male child, you would have intercourse close to ovulation, so the first sperm to get to the egg would have a higher probability of being male. If you wanted to have a female child, you would have intercourse 2 to 3 days prior to ovulation. Obviously, you have to know when you ovulate. Prior to ovulation, therefore, a higher proportion of those sperm would be carrying the X chromosomes, and you would have a female child. My sister swears this works. They got a boy their first time. She wanted a girl for their second child, and they got a boy. So I said, obviously it doesn't work. She said, no, we didn't try it. She said, I think I was asleep. when we had sex the second time. So I didn't have a chance to decide whether we were having sex or not. So I couldn't make, you know, the determination of the timing and all of this. So I was like, okay. And then they still wanted to have a girl. And so she looked around and she said, you know, all the families I look at, 90% of the time, if they have two the same gender for the first two children, 90% of the time, the third child is the same gender. So in our family, there's 3 girls. My cousin's family, there's 4 girls. All right, so on. So she decided that she didn't want a third boy. She wasn't willing to risk a third boy for the chance of getting a girl. So they're stayed with 2 boys. I almost said stuck, but that didn't quite sound right. So they stayed with 2 boys. Her sister, I told some of you this, her sister-in-law, her husband's sister, married a reproductive endocrinologist, a medical doctor who specializes in endocrinology problems, issues of the reproductive system. They had 3 boys. And there was another example. We start with one gender a couple times, and that's what you have. And she really wanted a girl. So they decided to try again, and she got her girl. She also got 2 more boys. She had triplets. And I said, that's a great advertisement for her husband's, but it was all no hormones. They just, you know, had intercourse. But having running around with 6 kids is proof that he knows what he's doing, apparently. Fortunately, I suppose, he made enough money that they could hire live-in nannies and full-time gardeners and 2 or 3 vans and all that kind of stuff. But anyway.